The Sterling Room was not the kind of place where regular people ate dinner. It was a private club tucked away on the 32nd floor of a Manhattan high-rise, the kind of place where a single bottle of wine cost more than most people's rent. The walls were covered in dark wood paneling that had been imported from some castle in England. The chandeliers were made of crystal that had been hand-cut by craftsmen in Venice. And the members, well, they were the kind of people who never looked at price tags because they had never needed to. Elena had worked there for 3 years. She was 26 years old, with dark hair she kept pulled back in a neat bun, and hands that were always busy, carrying plates, pouring wine, clearing tables, staying invisible. That was the job, really. To move through the room like a ghost. To anticipate what the members needed before they even knew they needed it, and to never, ever draw attention to yourself. She was good at it. She had to be. The tips at the Sterling Room were better than anywhere else in the city, and she needed every dollar. Her mother's medical bills had been piling up for years. Her younger brother was in his 2nd year of college, and someone had to help with tuition. Elena couldn't afford to make mistakes. On this particular Thursday evening in October, the private dining room at the back of the club had been reserved for a group of 8 men. They worked at some hedge fund downtown, and they were celebrating a deal that had apparently made them all very rich. Not that they needed more money, but that was how it worked with people like this. They always wanted more. Elena had been assigned to their table. She could tell within the first 5 minutes that it was going to be a long night. The man at the head of the table was named Richard Thornton III. She knew this because he made sure everyone knew it. He was in his early 50s, with silver hair and a watch that probably cost more than her apartment building. He was the loudest of the group, the one who laughed the hardest at his own jokes, the one who snapped his fingers when he wanted more wine instead of simply asking like a normal human being. By 7 o'clock, they had gone through 4 bottles of expensive Burgundy. By 8, they had moved on to whiskey. Their voices got louder. Their jokes got cruder. Elena moved around the table quietly, refilling glasses, clearing plates, keeping her face perfectly neutral no matter what she heard. At some point during the evening, a pianist had arrived to play background music. He was a young man in a tuxedo who sat at the grand piano in the corner of the room and played soft jazz standards. Nobody was really listening to him. The piano was just another decoration, like the chandeliers and the expensive art on the walls. Around 9:30, the pianist excused himself for a break. He had been playing for over 2 hours straight, and his fingers needed rest. He slipped out through a side door, and the room fell into a relative quiet, filled only with the sounds of clinking glasses and male laughter. That was when Richard Thornton noticed Elena. She had been reaching across the table to collect an empty plate when he grabbed her wrist. Not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to make her freeze. "Hey," he said, his words slightly slurred from the whiskey. "Hey, you. What's your name?" Elena kept her voice calm and professional. "Elena, sir." "Elena." He repeated it slowly, like he was tasting the word. "That's pretty. Where are you from, Elena?" "Queens, sir." The men around the table chuckled at this. Queens. How ordinary. How amusing. Richard didn't let go of her wrist. His eyes traveled over her face, her uniform, her hands. Something in his expression shifted. He was bored, Elena realized. Bored with his celebration, bored with his friends, bored with his money. And when men like this got bored, they looked for entertainment wherever they could find it. "You know what that is?" Richard nodded toward the piano in the corner. "That's a Steinway Model D. Concert Grand. You know how much that thing costs?" Elena shook her head slightly. "About $170,000. Richard smiled, pleased with himself. "My daughter takes piano lessons. $800 a week I pay for that. Best teacher in Manhattan." He paused, studying Elena's face. But I bet you've never even touched a piano, have you? People like you can't afford lessons. Can't afford anything, really? The other men at the table were watching now. Some of them looked uncomfortable. Most of them just looked entertained. Elena said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that saying nothing was the safest choice. Richard finally released her wrist and gestured toward the piano with his whiskey glass. Go on, then. Sit down. Play something. Elena blinked. Sir? You heard me? Richard's smile widened. It wasn't a kind smile. I want to see what happens when someone like you sits at a piano like that. It'll be funny. Come on, give us a show. One of the other men pulled out his phone and pointed it at Elena. He was going to record this. Of course he was. This was entertainment for them, watching the help embarrass herself at a piano she had no right to touch. Elena glanced toward the doorway, where her manager, Mr. Patterson, was standing. He was a thin man in his 60s who had worked at the Sterling Room for decades. He understood exactly what was happening. She could see it in his eyes. But he also understood that Richard Thornton was one of the club's most important members, and that keeping important members happy was more important than protecting the dignity of a waitress. Mr. Patterson gave her a small nod. The message was clear. Just do it. Don't make a scene. Let them have their laugh. Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. It was a familiar feeling. She had felt it many times before, in many different situations. It was the feeling of being powerless, of being invisible, of being nothing. She walked slowly toward the piano. Her footsteps were quiet on the thick carpet. The men at the table watched her with amused anticipation. Someone whispered something that made the others laugh. Elena didn't hear what it was. There was a strange buzzing in her ears, like static on an old radio. She reached the piano and stood there for a moment, looking at it. It really was beautiful. The black lacquer finish gleamed under the soft lights. The keys were perfectly white and black, waiting to be touched. She could smell the wood, the polish, the faint mustiness of the felt hammers inside. It had been 7 years since she had sat at a piano. 7 years since she had allowed herself to play. 7 years since she had lost everything that mattered and decided that music was part of a life she could no longer have. Richard Thornton's voice cut through her thoughts. What are you waiting for? Sit down. Show us what the working class can do with a real instrument. More laughter. Elena sat down on the bench. The leather was cool beneath her. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she didn't think anyone could see. She placed her fingers on the keys, and the touch sent a jolt through her body. It was like touching an old friend, like coming home. The men were watching. The phone was recording. Mr. Patterson was standing in the doorway with his apologetic, helpless expression. Elena closed her eyes, and then, for the first time in 7 years, she began to play. What nobody in that room understood, what nobody could have possibly guessed just by looking at her, was that Elena Vasquez had once been someone completely different. She had lived another life, in another country, in what sometimes felt like another universe altogether. And the piano that Richard Thornton thought she had never touched before? She had spent more hours at instruments just like it than most professional musicians ever would. Elena was born in Havana, Cuba, in a small apartment 3 blocks from the ocean. Her father was a professor of literature at the university. Her mother taught elementary school. They were not rich by any measure, but they had books and music and love, and for a long time, that felt like enough. She discovered the piano when she was 4 years old. There was an old upright in the community center near their apartment, a battered thing with chipped keys and a sound that was slightly out of tune. Elena's mother had taken her there for a children's program, and while the other kids played with toys in the corner, Elena wandered over to the piano and pressed a key. The sound it made changed something inside her. She pressed another key, then another. She wasn't just hitting them randomly. Even at 4, she was listening. She was figuring out how the sounds connected, how they could talk to each other. By the time her mother came to collect her an hour later, Elena had picked out a simple melody entirely on her own. Her parents couldn't afford lessons. But word spread about the little girl at the community center who seemed to have a gift, and eventually a retired music teacher offered to work with her for free. His name was Professor Delgado, and he was 73 years old with arthritic hands that could no longer play the way they once had. But he could still teach. And when he heard Elena play for the first time, tears rolled down his wrinkled cheeks. "This child," he told her parents, "is not ordinary. This child has something that cannot be taught. It can only be given by God." By the time Elena was 8, she was performing at local concerts. By 10, she was invited to play for government officials. By 12, she performed Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with the Cuban National Symphony Orchestra, becoming the youngest soloist in the orchestra's history. The concert was broadcast on national television. People who knew nothing about classical music watched in amazement as this small girl with dark braids commanded an instrument nearly twice her size. Her father cried that night. He held her face in his hands and told her that she was going to do incredible things, that she was going to see the world, that her music would touch people in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Elena believed him. Why wouldn't she? Everything he had ever told her had turned out to be true. At 16, Elena was invited to compete in the International Chopin competition in Warsaw, Poland. It was one of the most prestigious piano competitions in the world, held only once every 5 years. The greatest pianists of the 20th century had competed there. And now, Elena Vasquez from Havana, Cuba, was going to take the stage. She performed 4 rounds over 3 weeks. With each round, the competition grew fiercer, the pressure more intense. Pianists from Russia, China, Japan, Poland, the United States, they were all technically brilliant, all highly trained, all desperate to win. But there was something about Elena's playing that set her apart. It wasn't just her technique, though her technique was flawless. It was the emotion. When Elena played, you didn't just hear the music, you felt it. It reached inside your chest and grabbed your heart and wouldn't let go. She won. At 16 years old, she became the youngest winner of the International Chopin competition in over 4 decades. The judges called her a once-in-a-generation talent. Critics wrote that she played with the wisdom of someone who had lived 100 lives. Conservatories from Juilliard to Vienna to Moscow offered her full scholarships. The whole world seemed to open up before her like a flower blooming in fast motion. For 2 years, everything was perfect. Elena traveled. She performed. She recorded an album that won critical acclaim. She was on the cover of music magazines. She was interviewed on television programs around the world. She was, by every measure, living her dream. And then, 3 months after her 19th birthday, everything fell apart. Her father had always been outspoken. He wrote essays criticizing certain government policies. He believed in freedom of expression, in the right to question authority, in the power of words to change the world. For years, his reputation as a professor and his daughter's fame as a musician had protected him. But that protection had limits. One night, men came to their apartment. They took her father away. No explanation, no charges. Just gone. Elena's mother was paralyzed with fear. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't function. Elena tried to use her connections, her fame, her money to find out where her father was being held. But doors that had once opened for her were suddenly closed. People who had once praised her talent now avoided her calls. She learned very quickly that fame meant nothing when it went against the interests of powerful people. 3 months later, they received word. Her father was alive, but barely. He had been beaten. His health was failing. If they wanted to see him again, they had to leave the country immediately. There were people who could help them escape, but it had to happen now. And they could take nothing with them. No documents, no money, no proof of who they had been or what they had accomplished. They left in the middle of the night on a small boat with 12 other people. Elena's mother clutched a plastic bag with some photographs and a change of clothes. Elena carried nothing but the dress she was wearing. She watched the lights of Havana disappear behind them and felt something inside her die. They made it to Miami after 4 days at sea. They were processed by immigration, given temporary papers, placed in a small apartment in a neighborhood filled with other refugees. Elena's mother found work cleaning hotel rooms. Elena got a job at a restaurant washing dishes. The girl who had performed for presidents and won international competitions was now scrubbing pots in a hot kitchen for minimum wage. Her father arrived 3 months later. The people who had promised to help him had kept their word. But he was not the same man who had been taken from their apartment. He was thin, broken, haunted. He couldn't walk without help. He couldn't sleep without nightmares. The things that had been done to him in that prison had destroyed something essential inside him. He died 6 months after that. A heart attack, the doctors said. But Elena knew the truth. His heart had been broken long before it stopped beating. After the funeral, Elena's mother packed away all the photographs of Cuba, all the newspaper clippings about Elena's performances, all the programs from her concerts. She put them in a box and stored it in the back of a closet, and neither of them ever opened it again. Elena did not touch a piano for 7 years. She couldn't. Every time she saw one, every time she heard classical music playing somewhere, the grief hit her like a physical blow. The piano was tied to her father, to Cuba, to everything she had lost. Playing it would mean feeling all of that pain, and she simply couldn't bear it. So she worked, she waitressed, she moved to New York when her mother's health stabilized. She got the job at the Sterling Room because the tips were good, and she could stay invisible. For 7 years, she pretended that the girl who had won the Chopin competition didn't exist anymore. She buried that part of herself so deep that most days she almost believed it was gone. But now, sitting at the Steinway in the private dining room, while drunk men laughed and pointed their phones at her, something was happening. Her hands were on the keys, the familiar weight of them. The cool smoothness of the ivory was sending signals through her body that she had forgotten existed. Memories were flooding back, her father's voice, Professor Delgado's patient instructions, the roar of applause in Warsaw. Richard Thornton wanted her to embarrass herself. He wanted to laugh at the waitress who didn't know how to play. He had no idea what he had just done. The room was quiet now, except for the soft clink of ice in whiskey glasses and the occasional snicker from the men at the table. They were waiting for the joke to play out, waiting for the waitress to fumble around on the keys like a child, to prove what they already believed about people like her. Elena sat very still on the piano bench. Her fingers rested on the keys but did not move. Her eyes were closed. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, could hear the blood rushing in her ears. Somewhere behind her, Richard Thornton said something to his friends and they laughed. She didn't hear what it was. She wasn't in that room anymore. Not really. She was back in Havana. She was 4 years old, standing on her tiptoes to reach the keys of that old, upright piano in the community center. She was 8, performing for the first time in front of an audience, her small hands trembling with excitement. She was 12, walking onto the stage with the National Symphony, the lights so bright she could barely see the crowd. She was 16 in Warsaw, playing the final notes of the competition and hearing silence before the explosion of applause. And she was 19, watching her father being taken away in the middle of the night, his eyes finding hers one last time before he disappeared through the door. The memories came flooding back, all of them at once, and for a moment Elena felt like she was drowning. This was why she had stopped playing. This was why she couldn't do it anymore. The music was connected to everything, the joy and the pain, the triumph and the loss. You couldn't have one without the other. But then, somewhere in the chaos of her mind, she heard her father's voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper from very far away. But she recognized it immediately. She would have recognized it anywhere. "Play, mi amor," he said. "Play for me." Elena opened her eyes. The piano gleamed before her. The keys waited, patient and silent, just as they had waited for 7 years. Behind her, the men were still laughing, still recording, still expecting their entertainment. They had no idea. They had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. She chose the piece without thinking. It came to her the way breathing came, automatic and necessary. Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor. It was the piece she had played when she won in Warsaw. It was the piece her father had loved most. It was the piece that had changed her life. She pressed the first chord. The sound that came out of the Steinway was rich and deep, filling the room like water filling a glass. It was just one chord, just a few notes, but something in the quality of it made the laughter behind her falter. There was weight to it, intention. This was not the random fumbling of someone who had never touched a piano. Elena began to play. The ballade starts quietly, almost gently. It's like someone beginning to tell a story, not sure yet where it's going to go. The melody is simple at first, wandering and thoughtful, like a person walking alone through empty streets at night. Elena let her fingers find the notes, let the muscle memory that had been dormant for 7 years slowly wake up. It was strange at first. Her hands felt stiff, uncertain. The notes came a fraction of a second slower than they should have. But with each measure, something was loosening inside her. The rust was falling away. The music was coming back. At the table behind her, Richard Thornton had stopped laughing. His whiskey glass hung suspended halfway to his lips. His brow was furrowed, confusion replacing the smug amusement that had been there moments before. Something was wrong. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The other men had gone quiet, too. One of them lowered his phone slightly, no longer recording for a joke, but because he wasn't sure what else to do. They exchanged glances with each other, trying to understand what they were hearing. Elena didn't see any of this. Her eyes were closed again, and she was somewhere else entirely. She was in Warsaw, on that massive stage, with thousands of people watching. She was in her living room in Havana, playing for her father while he sat in his favorite chair and listened with tears in his eyes. She was everywhere and nowhere, lost in the music that had once been her whole world. The ballade began to build. Chopin wrote it to tell a story, and like all good stories, it doesn't stay quiet for long. The melody grew more urgent. The harmonies became more complex. Elena's fingers moved faster, striking the keys with increasing intensity. The stiffness was gone now. Whatever had been blocking her for 7 years had cracked open, and now there was no stopping what poured out. In the doorway, Mr. Patterson's mouth had fallen open. He had worked at the Sterling Room for over 30 years. He had seen countless pianists play at that Steinway, society performers, jazz musicians, even a few minor celebrities. None of them had ever sounded like this. None of them had ever made him feel like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. One of the waiters, a young man who had been setting up the coffee service in the corner, had completely stopped what he was doing. He stood frozen with a silver creamer in his hand, staring at Elena's back as if he was witnessing something impossible. The ballade reached one of its climactic passages, a section filled with crashing chords and sweeping arpeggios. Elena played it with a ferocity that made the crystal glasses on the table vibrate. Her whole body was involved now, swaying with the music, her shoulders rising and falling with the phrases. This was not background music. This was not entertainment for bored rich men. This was something else entirely. This was a soul being poured out through 88 keys. Richard Thornton set his whiskey glass down very slowly. His face had gone pale. He looked at the men around him, searching for someone to share a knowing look with, someone to help him dismiss what he was hearing. But no one would meet his eyes. They were all watching the woman at the piano, The waitress who was supposed to embarrass herself, who was instead creating sounds that none of them had ever heard outside of a concert hall. The piece moved into a quieter section, a moment of reflection in the middle of the storm. Elena's playing became tender, achingly beautiful. There were tears on her cheeks now, though she didn't notice them. She was thinking about her father. She was thinking about the last time she had seen him, that night when the men came to take him away. She was thinking about all the things she had never gotten to say to him, all the years they should have had together, all the music she should have played for him. The ballade is about 10 minutes long. To the people in that room, it felt like both an eternity and a single heartbeat. Time had stopped making sense. There was only the music, only the woman at the piano, only the extraordinary thing that was happening right in front of them. Other people had started to gather. Guests from the main dining room, drawn by the sound. Staff members who had abandoned their posts. Someone from the kitchen, still wearing an apron. They crowded into the doorway, craned their necks to see, whispered to each other in disbelief. Among them was a woman named Catherine Chen, the owner of the Sterling Room. She was in her 60s, elegant and composed, the kind of person who was never surprised by anything. But she was surprised now. More than surprised. She was shaken, because Catherine Chen had been to Warsaw 15 years ago. She had attended the International Chopin competition as a patron of the arts. And she had watched a 16-year-old girl from Cuba win the whole thing with a performance that had made her weep. She was watching that same girl now. Elena played on, unaware of the crowd, unaware of the tears on her own face, unaware of everything except the music and the memory of her father and the feeling of finally coming home. The ballade was entering its final movement, and Elena could feel it building inside her like a wave about to crash against the shore. This was the part that separated good pianists from great ones. This was the part that had made judges weep in Warsaw. This was the part that required not just technical skill, but something deeper, something that couldn't be taught in any conservatory. Her fingers flew across the keys. The music had become a storm now, wild and untamed, filled with crashing chords and lightning-fast passages that most pianists spent years trying to master. Elena played them as if they were nothing, as if her hands had been designed specifically for this purpose. The Steinway responded to her every touch, its voice filling the room with a sound so powerful that the paintings on the walls seemed to tremble. At the table, Richard Thornton sat completely still. The arrogance had drained from his face. What remained was something harder to identify. Confusion, certainly. Disbelief. But underneath that, something else was stirring. Something that looked almost like shame. His friends were no longer looking at each other. They were no longer exchanging smirks or whispering jokes. Each man sat alone with whatever he was feeling, unable to hide behind the group anymore. The phone that had been recording earlier was now resting forgotten on the table, its screen dark. One of the men, a younger partner with slicked-back hair and a designer suit, had his hand over his mouth. His eyes were glistening. He would later tell his wife that he didn't know why he had cried. He wasn't the type to cry at music. He wasn't the type to cry at anything. But something about what he heard that night broke through every wall he had ever built. In the doorway, the crowd had grown. Word had spread through the restaurant like wildfire. People had left their tables mid-course, abandoned their wine glasses, forgotten their conversations. They pushed into the hallway, stood on their toes, craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the woman at the piano. Catherine Chen had made her way to the front of the crowd. Her hand was pressed against her chest, and her usual composure had completely dissolved. She was watching Elena with the intensity of someone witnessing a miracle, because that's what this was. There was no other word for it. The girl she had seen triumph in Warsaw 15 years ago, the prodigy who had vanished without explanation, was sitting at a piano in her restaurant, wearing a waitress uniform, playing Chopin like her life depended on it. The music reached a passage of almost unbearable intensity. Elena's whole body was engaged now, not just her hands, but her shoulders, her back, her entire being. She rocked forward and back on the bench, her face twisted with emotion, sweat beginning to bead on her forehead. This wasn't a performance. This was an exorcism. 7 years of grief, of silence, of pretending to be someone she wasn't. All of it was pouring out through her fingers. She thought about her mother, working double shifts at a factory in Queens, sending money back to relatives in Cuba whenever she could spare it. She thought about her brother, studying engineering at a state college, determined to build a better life. She thought about all the sacrifices her family had made, all the dreams they had buried, all the pain they had swallowed without complaint. And she thought about her father. Always, always, she thought about her father. He had believed in her more than anyone. He had told her that her music was a gift, that it didn't belong to her alone, but to everyone who heard it. He had said that playing piano was not about showing off or winning competitions. It was about connection. It was about reaching into the hearts of strangers and reminding them that they were not alone in the world. She had forgotten that. In all the years of silence, she had forgotten what music was really for. But she remembered now. The ballade hurtled toward its climax. The final pages of the piece are among the most demanding in the entire piano repertoire. The tempo increases. The chords become more complex. The dynamics swing wildly between thundering fortissimo and delicate pianissimo. Many pianists stumble here, their technique failing them at the crucial moment. Elena did not stumble. She attacked the passage with a precision that bordered on superhuman. Her left hand laid down a foundation of rolling octaves, while her right hand danced through the melody with impossible speed. The sound that filled the room was orchestral, massive, as if she were playing not one piano, but 10. Someone in the crowd gasped. Someone else let out a small cry. These were people who dined at the most exclusive restaurants in Manhattan, who attended galas at the Metropolitan Opera, who considered themselves connoisseurs of culture and taste. They had heard plenty of good music in their lives, but they had never heard anything like this. The piece reached its peak, a moment of absolute catharsis, and then began its descent toward the ending. The storm was passing. The thunder was fading. But the emotion remained, heavy in the air like the smell of rain after a downpour. Elena played the final passages with a tenderness that was almost painful to witness. The music became quiet, introspective, as if the storm had revealed something fragile and precious hidden beneath the chaos. Her touch on the keys was featherlight now, each note hanging in the air for just a moment before dissolving into silence. The last chord of the ballade is famous among pianists. It's a simple chord, played quietly, but it carries the weight of everything that came before. It's like the final word of a story that has broken your heart, the period at the end of a sentence you never wanted to end. Elena played that chord. And then there was silence. Complete, absolute silence. No one moved, no one breathed. The room was frozen, suspended in the aftermath of something extraordinary. Elena sat very still at the piano. Her hands remained on the keys, trembling slightly. Tears were streaming down her face, dripping onto her black uniform, but she made no move to wipe them away. She felt empty in the best possible way, like a vessel that had finally been allowed to pour out everything it had been holding. For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched on, so profound that it seemed to have weight. Then Catherine Chen began to clap. It was a single sound at first, just her two hands coming together in the quiet room. But it was like a match striking in darkness. Within seconds, the entire doorway erupted in applause. Staff members, guests, strangers who had wandered in from the street, all of them clapping with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Someone let out a whoop. Someone else shouted, "Brava!" The noise built and built until it was almost as overwhelming as the music had been. At the table, the hedge fund men sat in stunned disarray. A few of them clapped automatically, looking dazed. One man had his head in his hands. Another was openly crying, making no effort to hide it. Richard Thornton did not clap. He stared at Elena's back with an expression that was difficult to read. His face had gone through several transformations over the past 10 minutes. Amusement to confusion, confusion to shock, shock to something that might have been wonder. And now, at the end, what remained looked a lot like devastation. Not the devastation of a man who had been proven wrong. The devastation of a man who had just realized, perhaps for the first time in his life, what kind of person he really was. Elena stood up from the piano bench. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her. She turned around slowly, facing the room for the first time since she had begun to play. The applause continued, thunderous and relentless. People were on their feet now. Someone was pressing forward, trying to reach her. Questions were being shouted from the crowd. Who was she? Where had she trained? Why was she working here? Elena didn't answer. She smoothed the front of her uniform with shaking hands. She wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her wrist. And then, without saying a single word, she walked toward the service door that led to the kitchen. The crowd parted to let her through. The applause followed her like a wave, but she didn't look back. She pushed through the door and disappeared into the back of the restaurant, leaving behind a room full of people who had just witnessed something they would never forget. The video was uploaded to the internet at 11:47 that night. A woman who had been dining at a table near the doorway had recorded nearly the entire performance on her phone. She posted it with a simple caption. A waitress was forced to play piano by some rude customers. What happened next left everyone speechless. By morning, the video had been viewed 2 million times. By noon, it had reached 10 million. By the end of the week, it had crossed 50 million views and was still climbing. News outlets around the world picked up the story. Television programs played clips of the performance. Journalists scrambled to find out who the mysterious waitress was and how she had learned to play like that. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. Someone recognized her face from old competition footage. A music blogger in Poland dug up articles from 15 years ago. Within days, the whole story was everywhere. Elena Vasquez, the Cuban prodigy who had won the international Chopin competition at 16. The girl who had been called a once-in-a-generation talent. The musician who had vanished without explanation nearly a decade ago. She had been working as a waitress in Manhattan, invisible to the world until one cruel man had accidentally put her back in front of a piano. The internet did what the internet does. It celebrated her. It mourned for her. It raged at the men who had tried to humiliate her. Richard Thornton's name was discovered and spread across social media. People found his company's website. They found his photograph. They left thousands of angry comments on every platform where his name appeared. Elena did not participate in any of this. The morning after the performance, she showed up for her shift at the Sterling Room as if nothing had happened. She tied her hair back. She put on her uniform. She was ready to work. Catherine Chen was waiting for her in the back office. The older woman looked like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red, and her usual perfect composure was nowhere to be found. She gestured for Elena to sit down, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I was in Warsaw," Catherine finally said. 15 years ago. I saw you win." Elena said nothing. Her hands were folded in her lap. "I cried that night," Catherine continued. "I've been to hundreds of concerts in my life. I've heard the greatest pianists in the world. But I had never heard anything like what you did on that stage. And last night in my restaurant, you did it again." Elena looked down at her hands. The same hands that had won competitions, that had performed for thousands, that had spent the last 7 years carrying plates and pouring wine. "What happened to you?" Catherine asked softly. "Where did you go?" So Elena told her. She told her about her father, about fleeing Cuba, about the years of grief and silence. She told her about burying the music because it hurt too much to let it live. She told her about becoming invisible because invisible felt safe. She told her everything, and when she was finished, both women were crying. Catherine reached across the desk and took Elena's hands in hers. "The world thought it lost you," she said. "But you're still here. You're still that girl, and I think it's time for her to come back." In the weeks that followed, Elena's life changed in ways she could never have imagined. Catherine used her connections in the music world to make introductions. Calls came from concert halls and orchestras. A representative from Steinway flew to New York to meet her. Agents from 3 different continents wanted to sign her. A famous conductor who had followed her career as a teenager wept on the phone when he heard her voice. Elena took none of it for granted. She approached each opportunity carefully, thoughtfully, the way someone approaches a fire after being burned. She wasn't the same 16-year-old who had conquered Warsaw without understanding what the world could take from her. She was a woman now, shaped by loss, hardened by survival, but still carrying inside her that same spark that had made her extraordinary. 3 months after the night at the Sterling Room, she gave a press conference. It was her first public appearance since the video went viral. Journalists packed the room. Cameras flashed from every direction. Everyone wanted to know about her past, her disappearance, her plans for the future. One reporter asked about Richard Thornton. He had released a public apology 2 weeks after the video spread, a carefully worded statement from his lawyers expressing regret for any offense caused. The internet had not been kind to him. His company had lost several clients. His wife had reportedly moved out of their house. "Do you have any response to his apology?" the reporter asked. Elena considered the question for a long moment. The room was silent, waiting. "That man thought he was putting me in my place," she finally said. "He wanted to embarrass me. He wanted to prove something about who I was and who he was. But he made a mistake. He put me back in front of a piano." She paused. "For that, I suppose I should thank him." The room stirred. Pens scribbled. Cameras clicked. "But I won't," Elena added, and for the first time since the conference began, she smiled. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Elena Vasquez walked onto the stage at Carnegie Hall. It was her first concert in nearly a decade. The program included works by Beethoven, Liszt, and Rachmaninoff. But the final piece was the one everyone was waiting for, Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The hall was packed. Every seat was filled. People had flown in from around the world to be there. Music critics, old professors, fellow pianists, ordinary people who had been moved by a viral video and wanted to witness the real thing. In the front row sat Elena's mother, wearing a new dress that Elena had bought for her. Beside her was Elena's younger brother, taking a break from his engineering studies. He held his mother's hand as the lights dimmed. Elena walked to the piano slowly, savoring every step. The Steinway gleamed under the stage lights. The audience fell silent. Somewhere in the darkness, thousands of hearts were beating in anticipation. She sat down. She placed her hands on the keys. She thought about her father, about everything he had sacrificed, everything he had believed in. She thought about the little girl in Havana who had discovered magic in an old, upright piano. She thought about the 7 years of silence and the night when a cruel man had accidentally given her back everything she had lost. She began to play. The music filled Carnegie Hall the way light fills a room at sunrise. It was beautiful. It was devastating. It was everything music is supposed to be and so rarely is. The audience sat motionless, barely breathing, caught in the spell of something they would remember for the rest of their lives. When Elena finished, when the last chord faded into silence, The audience rose as one. The applause was not just loud, it was thunderous, overwhelming, a wave of sound that crashed over the stage and seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. People were crying, people were shouting, people were hugging strangers beside them. The standing ovation lasted 11 minutes. Elena stood at the edge of the stage, tears streaming down her face, and bowed. She bowed for the audience. She bowed for her mother and brother. She bowed for everyone who had believed in her, everyone who had supported her, everyone who had helped her find her way back. But most of all, she bowed for her father, for the man who had told her that her music was a gift that didn't belong to her alone, for the man who had believed in her when she was small, who had sacrificed everything for his family, who had died before he could see her play again. She could almost hear his voice in the applause. She could almost feel his hands guiding hers on the keys. "I made it, Papa," she whispered to herself as the audience continued to cheer. "I made it back." And somewhere, she was certain, he was listening.